I better make this note before I forget. So yeah, I've kind of taken a small hiatus from developing the integration of metagram and metatype, and that's because I'm somewhat frustrated in getting a hold of some tools and instruments that would help guide some of my. I need to get some kind of. I've now got a better model in my head of how to go about it, I would say. Because I still don't fully know exactly what metagram is in relation to metatype. Like I don't know the full depth of the impact of the synthesis in some sense. But I mean I will go through the spectrum of variance in some sense, the kind of speculation that I have. But I have a general hope and idea that it will be one of, you see, I need to compare different types in juxtaposition as well, to be able to come to a more definitive conclusion. But I think that the overarching thing might be right is that depending if you are sattva, rajas, or tamas, I think that actually metagram maybe only relates to the unconscious side of the mind, because the unconscious side of the mind really is the most turbulent in some sense. And in some sense, that's what requires, let's say, the superego negative shadow, environmental shadow, to kind of create a chorus, to create a sort of a background medium and, let's say, vehicle to kind of uh, direct or induct or conduct a certain anatomy of, let's say, emotional tones or whatever, which then obviously are connected to these field circuits as well. So the unconscious side of the mind, I think, might be where people develop lots of peculiar dysfunctional things, where they are either creating parasitic or at least dysfunctional relations to how the contents of their unconscious side of the mind, which is, if that is actually the fully cashed out model of metagram, that in some sense metagram is the condensed anatomy. So in some sense, like in terms of how people, I think in some degree as well, metagram has a particular flow to it, and near the beginning of development, it's not all there. So, in some sense, the first step in metagram, the first emotional tone, because there's six interlocking things that essentially, that is what is growing up. That is actually what is developing in a human being, is that their unconscious is developing in some sense. And so, and depending on how well balanced that is, or the kind of the self realization or the self conscientiousness over the unconscious side of the mind, will enable and, let's say, promote egoistic um, conscientiousness in some sense, and therefore you will be able to navigate the role, because through your unconscious side of the mind, through the metagram emotional tones that are connected to the field circuits, you are able to see the other emotional tones. You're able to kind of understand the feng shui of all these sorts of things, because in some sense, through your sensitive antenna of your internal false ego complex emotional tones, you are in the field of karma. You're in the field of external false ego complexes, through the medium also of culture, through the medium of art, through the medium of seeing the intentionality of other things. You know that there's a subtle false ego imprint on those. You know, so there's karmic signature on things, and you know, when you belong to organizations, when you belong to all these sorts of things. So yeah, so the wonderful thing is that metagram comes with this package of field circuits, essentially, and then in some sense, so like what you can do perhaps is you can develop your some sense there I think in general there would be two major sections in metagram development, that essentially the first three steps out of the six stages of metagram are kind of like a complete set, and then you have the last three steps, and it's different for each guna. So sattva, rajas, and tamas will each have their own particular um, kind of flow and balance, as it were, and such. But the more important thing would be that this is why I think that people do often in their development, they reach a certain midpoint, maybe when they're 10 years old, 11 years old, something like that, where they actually have this kind, I've described it before as a kind of naive and not too pernicious form of naive narcissism in some sense, because they actually reach Keegan stage 4, but in a naive sense, and then they go back down into the unconscious side of the mind to complete the last three metagram steps or whatever, because these things, like the development of the unconscious, is happening at the same time that the four sides of the mind are being culminatively developed and walked through. And this is why I think human development takes so long. It takes like 28 years old, before you become, let's say, a proper adult, as it were. And that's, with quite concerted effort, I would even say. If you're not stuck in sort of Keegan stage 3 or something, or 4.5 or something like that. And in some sense, I would even say that there's a Keegan stage 5, which is what I would call something like the crucifixion, where the ego is actually hooking back up with the superego. Anyway, I've spoken about that or maybe I've made a recording about that, a very 5-minute recording on therapy, but I'll append it to this, or have it released at the same time. But so I think that metagram might literally just be the unconscious side of the mind in some sense, and it doesn't happen all at once in some sense. And I think as well that in some sense in some sense I think that you can track development of the unconscious side of the mind, or you can track the whole development of the whole false ego complex through maybe any side of the mind, but the trickiest one is the unconscious side of the mind, which is why it was worth inventing metagram, because the unconscious side of the mind is the most nebulous and complicated and confusing, and so knowing sort of in what stage you're in terms of metagram development, and you have to kind of complete the circuit, you have to make it a circle, as it were. And then, because then you can get bored with it, then you can kind of actually, because when you're in an arrested development in your metagram, you can't solve it. I think you have to actually fully explore it and elaborate it to some degree. You have to flow through it fluidly, as it were, to start seeing through it, to start making it transparent in some sense. So I think that is how it functions. And so in some sense you can kind of, maybe it's like if someone in metagram is sort of on the first two, let me just describe. So in some sense, how someone would be arrested in an arrested development of their metagram is that they would consciously take responsibility for some set of the steps or the stages. So they would take responsibility for step 1, step 2, and maybe step 2.5, but not quite the full 3. And then essentially they would project the rest on their environment. So they would be associated with people that provided that psychic energy to them on an external basis, or at least that they would allow other people, they would use other people to project onto them, in order to provide the buttressing of the component part that they are willing to take responsibility for. So it's a mix of an internal locus of control with an external locus of control that has this kind of codependent sort of balancing act attached to it. And then, in some sense, if you're able to take internal responsibility for all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in some sense, um, cover the same groundwork as corresponding to the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, the sin, but not in that order, because the metagram is out of order. So the unconscious sequence is actually is a misordering of the metatype ontological sequence, as it were, um, and that is a bit of a that is what makes, let's say, spiritual life so difficult and mysterious, as it were, is because the gunas themselves, in if they are representative of the unconscious side of, I mean, this is my way of trying to integrate it in some sense. Now it is weird because in some sense then what the unconscious side of the mind is doing is it's it's borrowing the components of metatype, and it's shuffling them in a particular way. It's shuffling them up in order to create a stable circuit, an internal circuit, but then that external circuit can also be in parts projected onto the environment. Um, Now, I mean, I've basically had this model in my head already for quite some time, um, with the field circuits and things like that. But the idea came to me, I guess, to say that actually this is what the unconscious side of the mind is doing. And I got this idea when I just thought I should stop trying to overlay it perfectly, metagram on top of metatype. What I should do rather is just to say this is metagram side by side with someone's metatype, and then actually just kind of highlight like a Christmas tree, like a kind of a traced Christmas tree sketch of the metatype of a particular type, with shading in or whatever. Because the thing about metagram, which is also important, is that each metagram emotional tone is not necessarily in the same metatype slot. It is bridging two slots in some sense, and then I'm not sure. You see, because metagram emotional tones are potentially ambiguous because you don't know which cognitive function in metatype is actually holding the charge. And in some sense, this is all, let's say, an unconscious projection anyway, or an unconscious impression, or something like that. It's just a kind of motif, perhaps. But my point is what I think that maybe the particular ordering, depending on, I mean, look, this is slightly conjecturous at this point, that perhaps what it is that the metagram sequence is fixed according to the subtyping of sattva, rajas, and tamas. And what is in fact happening there is whichever if those 6 stages have a stable correspondence to the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, the sin, um, then whichever one see that can't even work because it's interesting is that it does include potentially the trial and the sin, but not in the things that are available for metagram types. I think exclude the fourth side of the mind, the ego, exclude from the vanity onwards. It includes the death and the lust, but it does not include the vanity and the enticed lust, the trial and the sin of the ego. Those are in some sense native free theta in Scientology language, but essentially what that means is that that is what your mind is actually thinking through. That is the free hand that you have to actually manage your own false ego complex, in my language. You can actually use that to debug your system, as it were. But and essentially also to guide and to egoically structure what's going on in your unconscious side of the mind. So the unconscious side of the mind is it really is like the Matrix to some degree, but you have to kind of solve the puzzle of the Matrix in order to transcend it. Basically, you have to understand like what the control, with the system of control that it represents. What you have to understand it. You have to fully comprehend and somewhat know it inside out in order to kind of be able to renounce it. Well, it's not even that you would even renunciate it, because in some sense I think that the best thing you can do is kind of perfect the vanity and make sure that the inferior function is being accounted for by the vanity, and therefore the vanity is somewhat purified, and the parent function is not being corrupted by the vanity. So you don't have an enticed lust essentially anymore. The enticed lust is neutered, and that means that when the inferior function is leading into the next side of the mind and acting as the death for the next side of the mind, that eventually, I mean, the hardest developmental issue is how the unconscious side of the mind blossoms into the fourth side of the mind, the ego, and then once the inferior function in the ego is correctly founding the death of the ego, when that goes through its natural functioning of the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, the sin, that you can consciously get on top of that. You can consciously, because those are your active cognitive functions. That's your actual seat of consciousness. That's the highest seat of consciousness that you have. And everything else below that is well ordered in aggregating to that ego plateau, and from that vista, then you are capable of crucifying your enticed lust in your ego. And as long as you crucify the flesh of your enticed lust, then the inferior function essentially functions as the crucifixion, and the sin of your ego is kept in the body of your Christly understanding, as it were. And so in some sense you're taking individual responsibility for the emergent sin that would otherwise be so you are consciously sinning inside your mind, and you are taking on that sin of the world in some sense. So you're not sharing it with other people. You're burdening the ravage of it yourself, and that means that essentially your super ego gets redeemed. That the world tree, the knowledge of good and evil, essentially gets revived into the tree of life, essentially, and therefore you actually have completed the cycle, as it were, and you undo the let's say the original defective, erroneous form of thinking, because then your super ego essentially transforms from the spirit of man to the Holy Ghost, because essentially that is what the tree of life is. It is the tree in the midst of the garden that bears the fruit of the seed of the tree, inside the fruit, so it's the fruit bearing, uh, anyway, but the that it was essentially only the or yeah, so in some sense then the superego's death and lust are revived, um, because that was the biggest problem of the subconscious, is that it was being donated by the false prophet, the death and lust, um, which was the false prophet's, because the false prophet was essentially a parent function but without a backstory. So it could always just give the subconscious whatever it wanted in terms of its death and lust, because they were just um, they were only essentially codependent on one another, because the death was the plurality of the lust. So the lust of the subconscious was literally, could be anything. It was the whore of Babylon in some sense, um, and therefore the derangement of the belief structure in the subconscious, which is the kind of and this is why I think in Jewish mysticism, there's all this stuff about how children are innocent, until their mitzvah, until the witness of something, like, I can't remember what it's called, but something that eventually the Holy Ghost awakens in them, and then they start to understand right from wrong. That only happens supposedly at around 12 years old or something like that. That that essentially that looming, let's say, moral deficit of the awakening of the consciousness in some sense is because the unconscious side of the mind has been developed well enough that the ego is already being consciously, the fourth side of the mind is already kind of understanding that it's in misalignment with its own origin, that somehow the conscientiousness of the ego, of the kind of the beckoning of the Keegan stage 4 in some sense, of wanting to have a systemic or systematized uh, um, understanding of things, is is somewhat at odds with the origin story of the false ego complex. So there's a deep mystery at the beginning of consciousness, which is often experienced, in practical terms, as either huge gaps in developmental history, like people forget their early life, they forget their from age 0 to age 3. They just don't have. It's just a blank spot. It's just like a they grow. I mean, this is why it's called the unconscious side of the mind, is because once you are, let's say, actively convoluting your own metatype, which is somewhat necessary in order to um, model the interior territory, as it were, of because the only freedom that you ever have is in the ego. The ego is the only hand that you have to work on debugging and troubleshooting your own false ego complex. So there is definitely a lot to Scientology when it talks about free theta and stuff like that. But and I think that there might be a stage of development in which it is maybe helpful to develop what they call a theta clear. But it's interesting. I guess I have problems with that, but that I think is because I've maybe gone beyond that. I mean, that might help you in sort of becoming clear on the first dynamic, but it's certainly not going to help you be clear on the seventh dynamic, um, or even the fourth dynamic, and the third dynamic, which is perhaps the most uh, engrossing in having to manage, the burdens of the the epoch, of the ages, as it were, um, responsibly tending to the fires that need to be put out and such and such. Um, which means that one does not feel that comfortable to suddenly that the theta is that the thetan, the spirit, is comfortable beyond the body. I mean, I would say that I'm beyond the body in reference to the first dynamic, but I'm not beyond the body in reference to the third dynamic because I have a lot of work to do. But anyway, and never mind, even with the general integration that I would say is on being clear on the seventh dynamic as well, which is that, well, I mean that's a hugely broad topic, but there are a lot of things that need to be fixed. There are a lot of integrations and syntheses that need to happen. Anyway, did I cover? Okay, I think I basically covered everything that I wanted to cover. Except, okay, I don't know if I got to the practical point of saying that even with, let's say, what I would call the I haven't fished out my old terminology, but essentially that you get emotional tones that are where one emotional tone is functioning in the displacement of another emotional tone, and you get other emotional tones where both are positively present, but one is taking the lead over the other. So the one is taking an adoptive role, and the other one is taking a negational role over the other one. And in some sense, I think that it might also be ambiguous, but also you might be able to use the subtype of tamas, rajas, and sattva with those particular sequences that are distinct, to know perhaps that maybe there's a sub-variation within, for example, those negational emotional tones, that actually the charge is being held by in the negational slot, or it's being held in the substitutional thing that is doing the negating. You would think maybe, I mean, I'd have to look at this through the clerical representation of the types, but essentially, it there might be a variance that essentially you could have two expressions of the same type of type essentially, and then essentially you could see that essentially those types of emotional tones then would have a particular gender, or I mean to use gender as a metaphor, um, because then you would get two people that had the same emotional tone, but one of them would be, let's say, the charge would lie on the negated cognitive element, and the other one, the charge would uh, would be on the substitutional cognitive element, um, and that might also have to do with, let's say, certain cultural or enculturated gender stereotypes and things like that, but also how essentially karma, and I mean, this is famous in some sense, in some languages and some cultures, some objects are considered, are essentially given. French famously does this, anyway, but that would give extra layers of understanding why there are certain asymmetrical magnetic attractions between certain types that are essentially corresponding to one another, because, and in some sense that might even be to some degree healthy, perhaps, if done in certain settings and in a certain procedural way. That might be also how some people gain a foothold into developing and seeing past their arrested development in their unconscious side of the mind or in their metagram. They would perhaps be able to connect deeply enough with another human being. I mean, this is also perhaps what the communion in the church is there to function as, is that you are breaking the bread, you're breaking down your own understanding and eating of other people's and feeding it to other people, and having other people break down their understanding it, feeding it to you, and therefore you are seeing the model of your full circuit in, let's say, that is being granted to you as a panacea in some sense, so that you can actually enliven your entire metagram circuitry and therefore run it out or exhaust it, or let's say get over it that much faster, because it's sort of you've got all of the and perhaps this is done in large part what's happening in terms of processing and such, um, which I do think perhaps could be more I mean, I can't talk too much about, because I'm not privy to the procedures and workings of different sort of things, but in some sense, I think that this is why perhaps sometimes teams of people working together are more, depending on how well they can be organized and such, are much more effective than solo practitioners, except if one is truly got. I mean, well, obviously, I think perhaps there are exceptions to this, because if you have enough of a model, if you have enough of what's going on, perhaps you would know specifically that actually you're not in a position to help people as much as you might want to help them, but you know that essentially somebody else would be better at helping them, or perhaps you know that you could direct them towards the kind of personality and how to correspond to that personality in order to but that's a bit that sounds a bit experimental, but anyway, but in some sense, you know that you would be better at helping certain people and less helpful at helping other people, but some people are just much harder to help. I mean, tamasic personalities are essentially so rooted in the middle of their. I think in some sense the problem with tamas is that they are almost. They start in such a strong position that it would be it would, to me, it would make sense that they would not want to continue to develop their metagram into a full circuit, as it were, or to, because essentially it would be so uncomfortable relative to the starting strength that they begin with, because they start in the vanity and the enticed lust as their first two stages in their metagram development, and those are the most stable parts of the false ego complex, because they have no overlap between the different sides of the mind. So they have such a strong core in their false ego complex. The sattva is given almost a gift, because they start in the trial, which is the most precarious part of the false ego complex, and then they go from the trial to the lust, to the child function. So literally, a sattva personality, the first stage of their metagram, if that is the description of their unconscious side of the mind, or let's say the story of their unconscious side of the mind, the first thing that they meditate on is their inferior function, and the second thing that they meditate on is their child function. And that's retrograde. That's going backwards. That's actually all the other gunas are always going basically in one direction. Okay, I must speak. They're always going in one direction at the beginning. They always go from start to towards the finish in terms of their first 3 or 2 steps. Sattva, the first step is high and the second step is backwards, is low. So already Sattva has got a huge clue that this whole thing is fishy. Their whole unconscious side of the mind, in some sense, is premised in the fact that this is a non sequitur, self-deluded sort of game that you're playing on yourself. In some sense, sattva is let in on the trick that Sattva is left is aware of the fact that the whole thing is bogus in some sense, and anyway, which doesn't necessarily mean that much, because as they develop their metagram further, um, they can also become desensitized to that and quite juvenile, because I mean, metagram, the development of metagram will always at some point go through the vanity and go through the enticed lust, and the enticed lust is probably the most dangerous thing to develop, which in tamas happens as the second step in their metagram sequencing. um, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't just quote it, but and in some sense rajas has its own tragedy, in that essentially their first step is the death, and their second step is the sin. So they already know right at the start, they know the beginning and the end of their own sequencing in some sense. And then all the other stages are just actually filling in the middle bit. So I would say that Rajas has its own quite poisonous fatalism attached to it, where essentially they they very they very much condition themselves on almost like an existential kind of way, that they kind of acclimatize themselves to the idea that you know there's nothing new under the sun, but to kind of that they're toying in the middle in some sense. It's not like they are naturally sort of spiritually defeatist in some sense. They just want to find a program that they can kind of fit within the lines thereof, to kind of be on the right side of something, so that they can toy, and kind of, so that within those lines they can kind of give themselves the leeway to kind of toy as they wish to. Or it's yeah, it is perhaps, let's say, existentially unfair that sattva is so much more enlightened as a natural kind of. I mean, that is not a perfect statement to make, because there are plenty of sattva who are uh, prone to bad faith and things like that, and in some sense it's more depraved when a sattva personality is doing that, because in some sense they should know better, and in some sense they do know better, and so it's more egregious in the extravagance and the decadence that they perhaps. Um, anyway, talking about this is kind of, it's not really worth it, because it's, this is just talking about degrees of depravity within some kind of moral concoction framework. It's not really that important. I mean, what the important thing is to get people through the Keegan stages, as it were, and onto what I would call Keegan stage 5, which doesn't exist in I think in Keegan's. I've only been told about the second hand. Essentially, I'm not that interested. But I mean, I think I've heard all the sort of the relevant conclusions about it. And my work, I think, is much more descriptive anyway. So I would rather just focus on finishing the description of psychology that I have. Um, yeah. So I think now, at least, I think I could write out coding, or I could write down an outline for a program that did these sorts of things. Problem is, I do I do just I guess I'm lazy, but also I want to. There was some other data that I wanted to just kind of mull over, just to make sure that I was keeping track of certain things, or just. Hmm. See, I guess I'm so lazy because I feel like it's so close to being finished. It's just these stupid clerical things that are kind of in the way. This is embarrassing. Perhaps I should admit it right away. I have been holding this back in some sense, but when I developed the correspondence between metagram and metatype, um, I lost that key on purpose because I didn't want to be corrupted by it, and I wanted to naturally rediscover that. And I did do it within my type, but I haven't even confirmed that it works for the other types. But I'm sure that it must because it corresponds so perfectly in my type. So that is a huge gamble that I'm kind of running with at the moment. But in some sense, if that doesn't line up, um, then then it's. I mean, first of all, I can't believe that it won't line up. So in some sense, that's falsification right there. So it's like I'm banking that I have been careful enough that it will line up. Um, but in some sense, this is why I want to code this, because in some sense I will be able to use this to test if I can code this. It should be codable, but I need to learn how to code, and I need to do it in Google Sheets or something like that, or I don't have Excel, so I need to. But essentially, that will be I could essentially, in theory, I should be able to write a computer program that matches, because all the metagram types are not like those are grouped. They're not like they're 48 metagram types, but I do have them in 17 groups. Those 17 groupings are stable, and that is part of the theory. But I didn't in a fixed correlated way put those 17 groups to the 17 metatypes, but I know that there is a fixed correspondence between that, with the added complication that some metagram types might be promiscuous. Um, because some of the simpler metagram types might conform to more than one metatype. But in terms of there's 17 groups of metagram, and then essentially there might be free radical versions of some of the metagrams that are promiscuous to other metatypes. That is something that also I could test as a metagram I could test through a computational program sort of procedure. But anyway, but that's an added complication. But first of all, I should very easily be able to write a computer program that would work out which group of metagram fits with which group of metatype within the certain stricture that I have already developed around that. So, and that would be a very clear falsification if that passes or fails. Um, or how close it comes to passing, and then I'll have to revise my metatype structure and see if that revision um, adapts the understanding of metatype in a way that is, obviously that's slightly sloppy to do that, but in some sense, I mean, it would be embarrassing for me to do that, because then I would kind of, then I would be fudging my own falsification. But then maybe also there's something that I need to learn. But in some sense, it'll prove how good a theoretician I am if I don't have to do that. But anyway, I'm making plain that is my schema, that is. Anyway, but I mean, this is 27 years work. Um, and sadly, I mean, apart from all the kind of the religious association to the 17 model of cognitive functions, that's going to be anyway. Maybe there'll be some Jungians that'll be interested in that. But essentially, I mean, philosophically, I think it will actually ground the field of psychology for the first time, and actually be able also to ground philosophy as well. Um, in essentially a phenomenological um, framework, uh, which could roughly be summarized as a kind of Platonic metaphysic. Um, sort of, I mean, I can kind of summarize a lot of things with the divided line, but it is a bit sloppy. Well, it's not sloppy, but essentially it's very low resolution. It's very compressed. And the actual psychological deep theory of mind is much more peculiar and strange, as it were. And it's not prone to, I mean, in some sense, the field circuits, I think, are probably a model of quantum mechanics because they have, um, there are four fields, there are four sections of, there are four distinct field circuits, and they each have six components, and three of them are those negative ones that I spoke about, and three of them are three of them are negational, and three of them are additive in some sense. And I think that that probably has a metaphor of spin in some sense. Um, anyway, um, because there are six spins in subatomic. Anyway, I mean, I'm not a theoretical physicist, but anyway, so I guess that's where I am, and I'm just kind of treading some water here, trying to get these resources. I should just maybe bite the bullet and see how much it costs to buy. I don't even know if they'll sell it to me. I guess I should ask. I'm trying to get these congresses, which are the last congressional lectures of what's it called, the anatomy of the bank. And the bank would be perhaps something akin to metagram or the unconscious side of the mind, or uh, which, you know, so in some sense I think that maybe the unconscious side of the mind in my model is something like uh, it's weird because the unconscious side of the mind is made up of a lot of components of the false ego complex as well, from the other sides of the mind as well, which then are kind of maneuvered in terms of the unconscious side of the mind and then surveyed over by free theta, by the ego. And in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind has to be ordered well enough that free theta can kind of float on top of it and let's say be the I don't know what the metaphor is, the wheel hand or something like that. The captain's wheel of navigating the ship, um, to kind of dial to the right context or something like that, where essentially the unconscious side of the mind is well enough configured that it's kind of in alignment with all the field circuits that it touches, that it has a hand in each of them, that it can resonate and kind of do a feng shui to all the other elements in that's part of that field circuit. But then it's also strange because some types are connected to more field circuits than other types. Some types are only connected to two field circuits, and as far as I can tell, I haven't I don't know this because I haven't got a computational way of displaying all the metagram types, but as far as I know, it's probably quite rare to find types that have a connection to every field circuit. And as far as I know, mine might be the only one, but I'm sure that there might be some others. But it might be that mine is the only Sattvic one. I don't know. Um, which is essentially I'm a meta type 13, I'm an angry 8. sattva, which is just I mean, my naming convention is really bad, but that's what you get when you've got 48 metagram types and you have to find a stable naming convention. The first angry 8, because there's a second angry 8, but the second angry 8 is not a metatype 13, it's something else. It's like a metatype 2 or something. Um, anyway, anyway. Yeah, in some sense, I think that's one of the stable ways in my naming convention, because there are 24 emotional tones, and in some sense, in my naming convention, there are two of each. So you get like, but in some sense, that isn't the only emotional tone that metagram type has. That's just the emotional tone that corresponds to what I call the counter effort, the primary counter effort, um, because the primary counter effort in all the types is only one emotional tone. It's unique in that way because some emotional tones have split stimulus functions and some of them have split emergent response functions, but they only ever have one primary counter offer. Um, in some way, it's the glue that holds the. It's probably the vanity. Um, yeah, well, you see, I don't know if I'm comfortable defining it that way, but the primary counter offer is probably to do with that middle axis in the false ego complex, the vanity and the enticed lust that isn't shared by other sides of the mind. So its components are not oversubscribed. But anyway, I'm talking about technical stuff now. Let me just stop this recording. Wheels and wheels and wheels. So complicated.